I'm Willett Kempton. I live at 79 Kells Avenue. I also teach at the University of Delaware, and I'm not going to speak from the heart. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to do the same thing I do in my day job, which is teach you a little bit about power and a tiny bit about CO2 emissions. So a bunch of people have mentioned CO2 emissions. CO2 is not a pollutant. It's not going to make you sick, but it will mean that Rehoboth is going to be underwater over time. So we don't want to confuse those two criteria. Pollutants make you sick. This plant is better than average in that area. In CO2 emissions, it's probably about a little bit worse because of the reasons that were mentioned earlier. Okay, so what about this sequestration of CO2? They're going to separate CO2 and they're going to put it to beneficial use. And let's look carefully at what that means. Does that mean you're only getting half the CO2 going into the atmosphere? The uses are food and beverage industry. So that CO2 gets sequestered in that Coke bottle, right? It goes on a truck, it goes out to the store, and then somebody opens that Coke bottle and it's not sequestered anymore. So this actually is no CO2 sequestration at all. So don't fall for that one. Let's talk about power now. Let's talk about power. 248 megawatts. Is that a little bit or is that a lot? You know, is that like enough to run this building? Okay, so is that enough to run the University of Delaware? 16 megawatts, the whole University of Delaware. So when the University of Delaware adds a 248 megawatt power plant, it's now using 15 times as much power and approximately emitting 15 times as much CO2. So that's a lot. How about Newark? This isn't enough to run Newark, right? To only 248 megawatts. How much does Newark require to run? Anybody know? 50 megawatts. You can run 5 Newarks with this single power plant. Now, you can't run the whole state of Delaware. The whole state of Delaware is 1,200 roughly evened out. But it's, you know, it's like a pretty big portion of that. You know, you're adding 20% to the power generation capacity of the whole state, just like back here in our neighborhood. So it's a large number. 248 megawatts is a large number. Now, let us understand the decision about power made by the data center, because I've spent like a couple of weeks trying to understand this. So they need 108 megawatts to run the servers. That's kind of weirdly large. NSA's biggest facility uses 75 megawatts, and this data center is going to use 108. Okay, maybe that's right. And then another 90 for cooling, so we're up to almost 200, and then 50 for redundancy. Okay, you know, I kind of understand those numbers, even though they're all about 2 or 3 times larger than you would think they would be. So where do we want to get this power from? Now, you put yourself in the place of the data centers. Let's just assume it's really true that you're in the business of processing data. If that's really your primary business, what do you care about? You care about uptime. You do not want your data center going down because a lot of the stuff you're doing is real-time transactions. So what's the reliability of a power plant? It's about 95%. Hey, that's great, 95%, like that's probably an A on a test. But let's look at 5%. Okay, so 5% stinks, but they're going to have redundancy in the power plant, so they'll have a modular power plant, so you could afford to have one unit break unexpectedly, and you still got enough to run the data center, and you can maybe even have 2 break unexpectedly, you still got enough to run the data center, so that's 5% squared, which is 0.0025. So 0.0025 of the time, you're going to be down, because your cool power plant actually had 2 units break at the same time. So that sounds like a good number, but let's come back to that in a minute. What are the other resources? If you're in the data center, you're looking at this site that the University of Delaware has just shown you, you say, hey, wow, there's 3 power lines coming into this site, and they're all 138 kV, and how much power could that provide? And so by the way, I've tried to check all the stuff with the data center, called them 3 times. They never give me any information. But anyway, some of these numbers may be a little off because I haven't been able to verify with the source, but we're in the right ballpark approximately. So power line reliability, way better than a power plant. It's about 99.99 or 99.999% reliability in a power line. That's not perfect either. you're going to be down some hours, but 3 power lines, 2 are coming from one substation, the third from a different one, very unlikely that those are all going to go down at the same time. Each of those power lines provides 180 megawatts. That's enough to run all your IT equipment and run your air conditioning at a slightly reduced rate. All you need is one power line. So 3 times 99.999, you get 0.00001% of the time you're going to be down. So let's translate that into hours over a 10-year period. Build your own natural gas power plant. You're down 219 hours. Use the 3 power lines for redundancy. You're down 3/100ths of a second in 10 years. Now let's just say you've got let's just say you've got data you want to crunch. Do you want to go to the data center that's down 219 hours in 10 years, or do you want to go to the one that's down 3/100ths of a second in 10 years? That's why I can't understand the business plan here. Now I say the same thing to power professionals, engineers who design this stuff, data center professionals. They're not quite as polite as I just was, but they'll make exclamations, and some of those I wouldn't want to say in a public forum, but it's not credible to power professionals. So what does that mean? I don't know if it means they're dishonest or they don't know or what. I don't know what the meaning of that is, but I would just urge everyone, there's something that has not been explained fully here. And I've tried to get the vendor to explain it.